So, there are people claiming that Helen of Troy couldn't possibly be portrayed by a black actress because it would be historically inaccurate. That's the argument making the rounds online. Personally, I think that debate is a lot more complicated than either side wants to admit. But before we get into that, let's talk about the man at the center of the controversy, Christopher Nolan. Love him or hate him, Nolan sits at the top of Hollywood. He's not just one of the industry's most respected directors, he's arguably the closest thing modern Hollywood has to a true movie star behind the camera. If you need proof, just look at Oppenheimer. On paper, it sounds like a movie that shouldn't have become a global phenomenon. It's a 3-hour historical drama, much of it presented in black and white, driven almost entirely by dialogue rather than action. Yet, it earned nearly $1 billion worldwide and swept the Academy Awards, including Best Picture. That's an extraordinary achievement, and it speaks to the trust audiences have in Christopher Nolan, which is exactly why it's so unusual to see his name caught in the middle of a culture war controversy. No, this isn't about the audio mixing that has people constantly reaching for the volume remote. It's not about the scientific liberties taken in Interstellar, and it's not even about the divisive reception of The Dark Knight Rises. Despite every criticism that's been thrown at him over the years, Nolan's films consistently make money, and his fanbase is among the most loyal you'll find for any filmmaker. I'd even put it up there with Steven Spielberg's following at its peak. That's what makes the conversation surrounding the Odyssey so surprising. Christopher Nolan has earned something that very few directors ever do: the benefit of the doubt. People used to joke that if Nolan wanted to detonate a real atomic bomb for Oppenheimer, Hollywood would somehow find a way to make it happen. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but it illustrates the level of confidence studios place on him. So, when the first casting announcements for the Odyssey began to roll out, most people, including me, were willing to assume Nolan had a plan. And to be fair, much of the cast looks impressive. Matt Damon may not be everyone's dream choice for Odysseus, but he's a proven actor. Alongside him are Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, Anne Hathaway, Jon Bernthal, Mia Goth, James Remar, Charlize Theron, and several other accomplished performers. Then, however, some of the more controversial casting decisions started generating debate. Whether those criticisms are fair or not is a separate discussion, but it's undeniable that they shifted the conversation from excitement about the film itself to arguments over representation, historical accuracy, and creative interpretation. For a director who has built his reputation on authenticity, practical filmmaking, and meticulous attention to detail, the change in the conversation is, at the very least, unexpected. As more casting announcements surfaced, however, the conversation began to change. Most of the ensemble cast received a fairly positive response. Even if some of the choices weren't everyone's first pick, there was little reason to doubt the caliber of the actors involved. Matt Damon as Odysseus may not have been the fan-favorite choice, but few would question his ability to carry a film of this scale. Robert Pattinson continues to prove his range with every project. Anne Hathaway has already worked successfully with Nolan on multiple occasions. Jon Bernthal, Mia Goth, James Remar, Charlize Theron, and Tom Holland all bring established careers and distinct screen presence to the production. Then came the casting choices that sparked far more debate. Some fans questioned Zendaya's reported role as Athena, arguing that the casting reflected Hollywood's growing preference for recognizable stars over performers who more closely matched traditional interpretations of the source material. Others disagreed, pointing out that mythology has been adapted countless times throughout history, with each generation putting its own spin on these stories. The discussion didn't stop there. John Leguizamo's involvement also drew attention, largely because of his previous public comments advocating for greater ethnic authenticity in casting. Critics argued that if authenticity is an important principle, it should be applied consistently rather than selectively. Supporters, on the other hand, viewed the Odyssey as a work of mythology rather than a historical documentary, making broader casting choices perfectly reasonable. Christopher Nolan also explained his decision to cast rapper Travis Scott, saying he wanted to acknowledge the poem's origins as an oral tradition, one that was passed down through spoken performance long before it was written down. He drew a comparison between ancient oral storytelling and modern rap as contemporary forms of verbal performance. Whether audiences find that comparison convincing is another matter entirely. For some, it was an interesting artistic interpretation. For others, it felt like an unnecessary attempt to modernize a timeless story. And then came the casting casting decision that generated the most discussion of all. For months, rumors circulated that Lupita Nyong'o had been cast as Helen of Troy. At first, many assumed the reports were speculative, but once the casting was confirmed, the debate intensified almost overnight. Helen of Troy occupies a unique place in Western literature. According to the myth, her beauty was so legendary that it became the catalyst for the Trojan War, a story that has shaped countless works of literature, theater, painting, and film for centuries. As a result, any reinterpretation of the character was almost guaranteed to provoke strong reactions. Some audiences welcomed the casting as another example of artistic freedom, arguing that mythological figures have been reimagined in different ways throughout history. Others questioned whether changing the appearance of such an iconic figure was consistent with Nolan's reputation for historical authenticity and meticulous attention to detail. Regardless of where people landed, one thing became undeniable. The conversation surrounding the Odyssey was no longer centered on its scale, practical effects, or Christopher Nolan's filmmaking. Instead, it had become another flashpoint in the ongoing debate over adaptation, representation, and creative license in modern Hollywood. The casting of Helen of Troy quickly became the focal point of the conversation. Helen is one of the most recognizable figures in Western mythology, the woman whose legendary beauty is said to have launched 1,000 ships and set the events of the Trojan War in motion. Because of that, any reinterpretation of the character was always going to attract attention. What surprised many people wasn't simply the casting itself, but that it came from Christopher Nolan. This is a filmmaker whose reputation has been built on meticulous research, practical filmmaking, and an obsession with authenticity. Whether he's constructing full-scale sets, shooting on location, or relying on practical effects instead of CGI, Nolan has cultivated an image of taking realism seriously, even when telling extraordinary stories. That's why some fans were caught off guard. They expected bold filmmaking from Nolan, but they also expect internal consistency. When a director is willing to build a full-sized, seaworthy Bronze Age-inspired vessel for authenticity, audiences naturally assume that same philosophy will extend to other creative decisions. The discussion quickly spread beyond film circles and onto social media, where it became another flashpoint in the broader debate over adaptation and representation. High-profile commentators weighed in, memes flooded timelines, and speculation about the rest of the cast intensified. One rumor that gained traction involved Elliot Page, although no official confirmation accompanied the reports. Even so, this speculation became part of the wider online conversation, illustrating how quickly unverified casting rumors can take on a life of their own. The controversy eventually reached mainstream entertainment media. Several publications argued that the backlash was being driven by online outrage rather than the film itself, noting that audiences were judging a movie they hadn't yet seen. Critics of that argument pushed back. Their point wasn't necessarily that every casting decision was wrong, but that audiences are entitled to form first impressions based on trailers, promotional material, and publicly announced casting. After all, that's exactly how marketing is designed to work. Supporters of the film, meanwhile, argue that the Odyssey is mythology, not documented history. Greek myths have been adapted countless times over the centuries, each version reflecting the culture and artistic priorities of its era. From that perspective, creative reinterpretation is simply part of the tradition. Opponents counter that mythology is still rooted in a particular civilization and cultural setting. Their concern wasn't that fantasy elements exist. Cyclopes, gods, monsters, and impossible voyages are central to the story, but that modern adaptations should still preserve a coherent sense of place and identity. That broader question extends beyond casting. Reports indicate that Nolan commissioned a full-sized ship capable of sailing across the Mediterranean rather than relying entirely on visual effects. Composer Ludwig Göransson has also spoken about experimenting with unconventional instrumentation to evoke an ancient atmosphere. Those decisions suggest a remarkable commitment to immersion, yet some viewers have questioned whether other aspects shown in promotional material, such as costume design, design, armor, accents, and modern dialogue reflect that same commitment. For those critics, the concern isn't one isolated decision, but what they see as an inconsistent creative vision. Whether those concerns ultimately prove justified remains to be seen. It's worth remembering that Nolan has earned an extraordinary level of goodwill from audiences over the course of his career. His films consistently attract enormous interest, and early ticket sales for the Odyssey suggest that excitement remains exceptionally high. That's why predicting the film's commercial performance seems premature. Even people expressing reservations about certain creative choices often acknowledge that betting against Christopher Nolan has rarely been a winning strategy. Ultimately, all of those debates will fade into the background if the finished film delivers. If the Odyssey succeeds as an epic adaptation, many of today's arguments will likely be remembered as little more than pre-release controversy. If it falls short, those same creative decisions will face far greater scrutiny. As discussion intensified, the controversy spread beyond film criticism into mainstream news, social media platforms, podcasts, and political commentary. Reaction videos accumulated millions of views, memes circulated widely, articles debated historical accuracy, others questioned whether historical accuracy should even apply to mythology. The conversation increasingly reflected broader cultural disagreements already present within contemporary entertainment. For some observers, the casting represented an example of modern Hollywood placing contemporary values above historical setting. For others, the backlash reflected an unwillingness to accept new interpretations of stories that have always evolved. Both perspectives framed the film as something larger than a cinematic adaptation. It became a symbol, a proxy for debates extending far beyond ancient Greece. One remarkable aspect of the controversy was its timing. Almost none of the public discussion concerned completed performances. There were no finished scenes, no full trailer, no context for how characters would be portrayed. Instead, reactions emerged from names on a casting list. This phenomenon reflects a broader transformation within contemporary filmmaking. Marketing now begins years before release. Audiences participate in production through constant online discussion. Every announcement becomes part of the narrative surrounding a film. Expectations solidify long before anyone enters a theater. Yet cinema has repeatedly demonstrated that first impressions are often unreliable. Heath Ledger's casting as the Joker was once ridiculed. Daniel Craig faced widespread skepticism before appearing as James Bond. Even Robert Pattinson encountered intense criticism before earning acclaim for The Batman. History suggests that casting controversies rarely predict artistic success. Ultimately, performances, not announcements, determine how audiences remember a film. The debate surrounding the Odyssey reveals less about one casting decision than about the changing relationship between audiences and adaptation. Ancient myths continue to inspire precisely because they remain open to interpretation. Yet each reinterpretation inevitably raises questions about fidelity, authenticity, artistic freedom, and cultural identity. Christopher Nolan's adaptation now carries those expectations alongside the immense challenge of translating one of humanity's oldest surviving epics into contemporary cinema. Whether the controversy ultimately proves significant will depend on a single question. Not whether every casting decision satisfies every expectation, but whether, when the lights dim and the story begins, audiences believe in the world Christopher Nolan has created. Because history rarely remembers the arguments that surrounded great works before they were seen. It remembers the works themselves. One of the most persistent arguments surrounding the Odyssey concerns a deceptively simple question. Is it history or mythology? The answer is both more complicated and more interesting than either side often acknowledges. The events described by Homer cannot be verified as literal history. Gods intervene in human affairs, sea monsters lurk beyond the horizon, a single-eyed cyclops inhabits a remote island, a witch transforms sailors into animals. No historian would classify these events as factual records. Yet dismissing the Odyssey as just mythology overlooks an equally important reality. Myths rarely rarely emerge from nothing. They are products of real civilizations. They reflect genuine geography, political structures, religious beliefs, and cultural identities. Although Odysseus himself may belong to legend, the world he inhabits was inspired by Bronze Age Greece, a society whose archaeological remains continue to emerge from sites such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Even many place names described by Homer correspond to locations that still exist today. In other words, the Odyssey occupies a fascinating space between imagination and memory. It is neither a historical document nor pure fantasy. It is mythology rooted in a recognizable civilization. Perhaps the most productive way to approach the controversy is to recognize that these perspectives are not always mutually exclusive. It is possible to value artistic freedom while also appreciating historical authenticity. It is possible to welcome reinterpretation while acknowledging that cultural settings contribute meaning to stories. Likewise, it is possible to reserve judgment until the finished film is released while still discussing the creative decisions made during production. Public conversation need not be reduced to opposing extremes. Art has always invited disagreement. Indeed, the enduring power of the Odyssey lies partly in its ability to generate new interpretations across centuries. Every age discovers something different within Homer's poem. Our own era appears to be no exception. History repeatedly reminds us that assumptions formed before release often dissolve once audiences encounter the finished film. A compelling performance can redefine expectations. Strong storytelling can transform skepticism into admiration. Conversely, even the most celebrated casting choices cannot rescue a weak narrative. In the end, the Odyssey will not be remembered primarily for the arguments surrounding its production. It will be remembered, or forgotten, for the film it ultimately becomes. And perhaps that is fitting. For nearly 3,000 years, Homer's epic has survived every reinterpretation placed upon it. It has outlived empires, kingdoms, revolutions, and civilizations. The debates of today are merely the latest chapter in a story that has always evolved. The real question is not whether Christopher Nolan has changed the Odyssey. The question is whether his version will earn its place among the countless retellings that have kept Homer's voyage alive for almost 3 millennia. If you love celebrity deep dives that go beyond the headlines, subscribe to the channel.